This ends up creating an image of people that's very far from the truth. Hello and welcome back to Background Voice. So quite a few of the episodes that I've made recently have been on cultural practices. I had an episode on Bharatanatyam, I had an episode on Pottus, an episode on eating with our hands. And one of the things that I've been trying to do with these episodes is explain the cultural significance of each of these practices and why they've created these particular art forms and what the history is behind them. And one of the biggest motivators for me to make a lot of these videos is because I really appreciate my culture and I would love to kind of spread that knowledge and improve cultural appreciation of Tamil and South Asian culture and why we do a lot of the things that we do. And that got me thinking, it would be good to look at the opposite. And that's why today I wanted to talk about cultural appropriation. I would say it's quite a difficult topic to talk about, mostly because a lot of people have very differing opinions on what's considered cultural appropriation and what isn't. It's not exactly a topic where you can clearly list out a set of rules and say, yes, this is cultural appropriation, and no, this is not cultural appropriation. It's one of those topics that seems to exist kind of in the grey, and once again, with people's differing viewpoints and experiences, there is a lot of debate that could be had. And a lot of the time, it's hard to tell if someone's appreciating or appropriating a culture just by taking a quick snapshot of whatever they're doing. And I think nowadays, with the current wokeness that people like to exhibit, we tend to assume the worst case whenever we look at these quick snapshots. Because of this, I think cultural appropriation is a topic that can really divide people. And I thought, seeing as I already make videos, why not just add to the many other videos there are on YouTube by adding my experience and my viewpoints on this topic. Of course, I've done research. I am going to try and be as factual as I possibly can, and wherever I mention my own experiences and opinions, I will state that as well. So let's get on to the bulk of this video. Culture and people's cultural identities are constantly changing. A lot of this is because of the modern world that we live in. We have so much exposure to different cultures around the world because of the opportunities that we have to travel, because of the internet, because of how multicultural a lot of our societies are becoming nowadays. It means that people do tend to identify with different cultures or different aspects of different cultures that may not technically be their own. And going into kind of darker territory, different cultures have different histories with how, they've been exploited or mocked or stereotyped. This is why cultural appropriation is usually a very difficult topic to give a very clear yes or no, right or wrong answer to, because every single scenario is very different, because every single culture and their histories are different. And also, some cultures just don't have a dark history of exploitation. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's okay to appropriate from that culture, because there is a cultural significance put by these people on certain practices or art forms or beliefs. And because of this, I think cultural appropriation is something that needs to be viewed on a case-by-case basis. I can't take you through every single example of cultural appropriation that has ever happened in the world, just because I don't have the time for that, and I don't think you have the time to be watching that. So I'm going to keep this episode quite a general view of cultural appropriation and why it's such an important topic and something to consider. Now, before we can define what cultural appropriation is, I think it's very important to define what culture is. According to Raymond Williams, who is a theorist from the 20th century, culture has three parts. Firstly, we have ideology. This is the least tangible form of culture, and it is the intellectual and/or spiritual ideology shared by a group of people. For example, it can be religion or patriotism. The second part is shared living. This is how the group uses their ideology to live within their day-to-day life. And thirdly, we have cultural production. This is how the culture is physically manifested. And this is the tangible portion of the culture that comes in the form of things like art, music, and clothing. This tangible part is the part that tends to be appropriated. So one of the biggest problems that we tend to have when discussing cultural appropriation is the fact that people do tend to define it differently. Some people take cultural appropriation as taking everything from the culture, whether that's the language, the cuisine, the businesses, the practices, the art. And others, myself included, tend to take cultural appropriation as taking elements that have cultural significance to people. And so I think it's really important to understand that there are certain aspects of cultures that can be freely exchanged. A very good example of this would be food, cuisine, or even music and movies. It's not really appropriating because there is an exchange between many different cultures when it comes to consuming these forms of a particular culture. And one of the key reasons why people are so upset by cultural appropriation is because it does tend to contribute to systemic racism. And with that, let's move into my mini history lesson. A lot of aspects from certain cultures that are being appropriated were originally used as an excuse to dehumanize and oppress minority groups by labeling them as primitive or uncivilized. During colonialism, culture stripping was practiced by a majority of the European colonies. It was almost like they had a How to Colonize for Dummies book that they all like to use. For example, Aztec and Mayan temples were being stripped and turned into Catholic churches. This was done to assert the colonizers' culture as the dominant culture. You see, people in the colonies were often forced to forget their culture because it would pretty much be a life or death situation for them. You had to act like the colonizer to be considered human. And that's basically why cultural appropriation is considered a form of exploitation. Minority groups are often targeted, and the original meaning behind the appropriated cultural element is often lost or distorted by the appropriator. Through this, there can be a great amount of disrespect shown to the culture or the religion from which it is being appropriated. This distortion also tends to reduce the deep meaning and ancestral practices down to exotic toys for the appropriator. Historically, most cultures were persecuted or ridiculed for embracing their culture and trying to live by their own cultural practices, because once again, it would go against the dominant culture and would be labeled as uncivilized. And this, for many communities, has led to a lot of deep scarring and also, I guess, internalized racism. Appropriating cultures can also be used to perpetuate stereotypes of people from those particular cultures. This is something that I hate, and I know people from many different minority groups or cultural groups hate it as well, because it basically allows caricatures to be created of your own culture and for false stereotypes to be spread around as well. Because these particular representations have actually made their way around, seeing as we tend to see a lot of American media. People around the world that may live in very homogenous societies and have not really had that much exposure to people of other cultural backgrounds may take these media representations or these caricatures or things that they hear and take that as fact. And this ends up creating an image of people that's very far from the truth. And this can also lead to people spreading a lot of hate towards communities just because of these false stories that are being spread. And so that's why cultural appropriation does tend to lead to systemic racism. Europe colonized a large portion of the world. And during this time, it was not a simple invasion to steal wealth and land. Europeans forced their cultural ideas on natives, stating that we were savages because we did not dress, eat, and behave the same way. And Western culture was forced upon many different countries around the world. And many of these countries only gained independence within the last century. People basically had to follow Western culture to survive. And no, I'm not exaggerating. And many traditional practices were made illegal, such as yoga in India. So you couldn't follow your culture out of fear of being persecuted. I want to end this video by saying anyone can culturally appropriate. I know we tend to associate cultural appropriation with certain groups of people, but you don't need to be from a particular culture or a particular ethnic group or a particular religion to appropriate a culture, because there are so many different cultures. There's so much that we don't really know about other cultures that it's something that's common, as something that many people do. Because of that, it's important for people of every single different culture, every single different ethnic group, every single different religion to put the work in to educate themselves, to broaden their perspectives, whether that's physically going to a place, whether that's reading up, whether that's watching a video from people of different cultures or reading books from people of different cultures. Opening up our perspectives is so important regardless of who we are. But that's what's on my mind. What do you think?